Growing up in a household with only the vaguest notion of God, somehow I still picked up the idea that God would be angry at me if I didn't believe in God. I'm not quite sure where I picked that up, but I remember thinking it was just very unfair and cruel that this maybe not existing being might be mad at me for not being sure whether or not it existed. I just thought that was kind of cruel. And I was scared.
Hi, I'm Neil, the 604 Atheist, and I do a little podcast where I talk to people about their deconversion stories. And I often hear that while they're still in that belief system that they came from, that they're told that people like atheists or any members of the LGBTQ plus community are evil or bad. And then when they find their way free and actually meet some of these people and get to know them a little bit, that attitude changes quickly, and they also tell me that they can never believe that they thought that way to begin with.
Welcome to Forsaking Faith, where we tackle these and other thoughts through discussion and contemplation.
This is Heather Bailey and Christine Goodrich. Our podcast explores the journey from fundamentalist Christianity to non-belief by examining the deep and nuanced effects of deconversion.
While some ex-Christians focus on the negative aspects of their past, we want to emphasize how leaving Christianity is a complicated process that brings both pain and joy. It is both loss and liberation. While we lose structure, community, and stability, we gain empowerment and agency.
We want to create a space for thoughtful discussion in this spirit, and we invite you all to join us.
Welcome back, everybody. We've been away for quite a bit of time. We know we've sort of gotten new jobs and moved on to new things, but Heather and I last year had recorded some episodes that I just couldn't really get into publishing. I don't know if it was, exhaustion or burnout, but I was just not ready to do it. But here I am amidst the quarantine, the virus that's sort of taken over our lives, and thinking that it's time. And Heather, agreed with me, and we thought we'd reintroduce ourselves. So in this episode, we talk about fairness and order in the way that it changed from when we were Christians until now. So Heather thought when she was young that everything was fair because sort of God had his plan. And then when she lost that security, that stability, it sort of fell apart. And for me, I felt like everything was kind of unfair when I was a Christian. I felt like I didn't belong, felt like my family was judged or mistreated. I mean, I didn't always feel that, but we did feel really different as kids. And Heather and I talk about how we related to each other and how we viewed each other during this time, and how we've sort of grown through our deconversion and into the fairness and order ideas that we have now.
I grew up with some very strict parents who were very disciplined, and so I had this strong sense of fairness and order that was partly to do with my parents' parenting style, but also deeply rooted in Christian fundamentalism, because the reason why my parents were so strict and rigid was because of their Christian values. So they really bought into the idea of the Protestant work ethic. So, this idea that in order to be, a good Christian, you are supposed to work really hard, and that God is going to reward you with success if you work hard. So that's the kind of ideology that governed my household. And so there was a lot of it was very regimented. There was a lot of structure, and we had to do chores and tasks starting at a very young age. I mean, even to kind of an extreme point. For example, as when I was in kindergarten, I had to pack my own lunch. My parents were really big on that. Told me that I had to do that all by myself, and which of course now as an adult I'm thinking about and knowing other parents, like that just seems really extreme. So the good thing that came of this was that I am very good with my time management now and very organized and, able to get things done on time, and that's all very good. But there were a lot of negative things too that were associated with this, and especially because I really relied on this dominant ideology that, the whole world works just like my household works. If I out in the world as an adult, if I work hard, God is going to reward me with financial success. If I do something honest or hold to my ethical value system, I will be rewarded for that, and people who don't do that are going to be punished. So it was really difficult for me when I deconverted, and I feel this very deeply, but it's taken me a while to work out that this is something that's tied to my deconversion process. I just remember for a while feeling very anxious about everything in relation to life and how chaotic the world felt. And then I started thinking more about how this was really related to this idea, to my childhood. And so when I deconverted, I lost that sense of the world works this way. The world is fair. There is an order to the world. And so it was very stressful for me, very, very difficult. And I still struggle with this.
Heather, I'm just wondering, you really didn't feel any chaos before you deconverted?
I did. I just didn't think of it as chaos because I was thinking of it in terms of this like wider narrative of, well, it's all going to work out for good in the end because God is in control. So things would happen that were negative. Yeah, I didn't perceive them as being chaotic. I perceived things as being negative, but then I was able to like frame them in this larger narrative. And so that's what I lost after deconversion, was the kind of, I obviously can't do that anymore. Something shitty happens to me now. I can't just be like, oh, well, this was meant to happen because God meant it to happen because God is testing me.
I see. So in a sense, the order, it didn't have like good or bad connotation. It just sort of had like predestined connotation.
Yes. Yes, and that for me is what order was. And that's what is scary for me after deconversion, is not having that sense of predestination. And with fairness too, because again, under that ideology, like even if someone has a really bad life and they're serving God, you can still say, well, they have a reward when they die. And so there's still this sense of like, fairness. I mean, that's where the fairness comes in. It's part of the order. There's still this sense that good people will have a reward, and that totally, you totally lose that when you deconvert, because then you have to contend with the fact that that's just not how the world works at all. So there's this interesting way, play on agency for me now, where I have to, I have agency. I recognize that I can make decisions that affect me, and I'm able to move through the world and make those decisions for myself. And that can be really positive and really empowering, and that is something that a place I've gotten to that's positive, but as a result of this, but it can also be anxiety inducing, and it took me a while to work through that. And I still have days, like earlier this evening, Christine and I were talking, and I was expressing that I'm very stressed about a move that I have coming up, and I still get scared when I think about how, there's not some sort of, again, like God that's really in control of my life and ordering my life.
Yeah. So Heather, I don't think we've done our mental health episode yet. So, but I do kind of want to ask a question that's related to that may ruin a future. No, I'm sure we have plenty to talk about. But I want to know, you've talked about to me that like your anxiety has sort of subsisted through your childhood and to now. And I'm wondering, why do you think Like, why do you attribute your anxiety to fairness and order now when it was so structured and so fair when you were young?
So you're asking like why my anxiety has manifested more?
No, I'm asking like you, because you've talked about how you did have anxiety too when you were younger.
Oh, right, about other things.
Yeah, and so I want to know, like, I understand that the anxiety kind of came from this idea of like no order, and maybe it was like exacerbated by that. But was there a sense of anxiety because there needed to be so much order, or like what did any of it come from, like that part too?
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that I obviously wasn't aware of this, but I think I felt very deeply a lot of anxiety in the form of pressure to always be responsible. And I felt like there was very high expectations, very high standards for my parents. And I also really felt like I was like having to, perform all of the time. I couldn't really be a kid. So I remember going back to like my parents being all about discipline and like working hard. I got a job at a very young age, and that makes me kind of, and I know a lot of people have to get jobs at young ages, but it's kind of sad because I felt like I didn't have, I felt like I missed out. I didn't really ever have like a teenage childhood where like summers were just free to relax like a lot of my friends did. I was like working from the time I was 14. So yeah, I think in that sense that made me anxious, and I think the way it manifests now is that I continue to feel that constant pressure on myself of I have to always be working hard, I have to be organized, I have to have my shit together. And I feel like if I don't have my shit together, the world's gonna like fall apart or something. So yeah, whereas I have other friends who grew up in like very privileged, upper middle class families, and they just don't have that kind of anxiety. I mean, that's not to say their lives are perfect, but they don't struggle with this. Like, they're a lot more chill about things, especially about like working and like procrastinating. I think a lot of it is because like those consequences weren't instilled in them as being real. Like, if they didn't work, there were going to be negative consequences. So yeah, like the positive for me was if I did work hard, there would be positive reward. But then the downside to that is also like there's going to be negative consequences if you don't work hard, that I think I've continued to subscribe to, even though I'm not a Christian anymore.
Yeah,
like the
I
Protestant
understand
work, the Protestant work ethic is still there, I guess is what I'm trying to say, even though I don't believe in God.
It's really interesting. So do you like, are you glad about any of that?
Well, I mean, I think I'm happy that it has allowed me to be successful in my career. Certainly, like being organized and like having my shit together. But I wish I could relax more. I have many moments where I think that, and I really regret not being more relaxed as a teenager.
Yeah, I imagine that. I mean, I imagine that many like people with military parents can relate to you, or at least like stereotypical military parents. I'm not sure they're all like that, but certainly I can understand that. However, knowing your parents, for me, that doesn't really connect, right? Your parents weren't very malicious, right? It's hard to imagine such like meek, docile people from the outside, not necessarily, they may not have been like that when you were younger, but or in closed doors, or behind closed doors, but certainly it's kind of funny to be like, well, those people made their children make their own lunch. And I think it'd be cool to make my daughter make her own lunch, but like from a more like playful, not you have to kind of attitude,
Right. Yeah. My parents they weren't like authoritarian in personality, you're right, but in their child rearing practices, they were quite like, discipline is important. A parent's authority and obedience to parents is important. Like that kind of stuff. And yeah, the lunch thing, chores, we had to do chores even at that very young age. So anyway, so yeah, that's definitely all affected me. And then in terms of anxiety more broadly, I have anxiety issues anyway, but I think they certainly get exacerbated by some of this. And so now on a macro level too, it's hard because the political landscape is tough, and it's hard to see, politicians. It's just hard. It's hard to watch, to come to terms with a reality that you can be a horrible human being and get a lot of money and be successful in this world, and it's hard, and I still struggle with that sometimes.
Yeah, I hear you there. Definitely. I understand that. So I just wonder, I want to know if, so I had trouble when I was a Christian with people who shouldn't be in high position who still were, because I didn't understand. It was always sort of about God's bigger plan, and I always kind of thought if God is so omnipotent that he could figure out a better way, okay, so this guy has to be cruel to his wife so that you can set a country free, from communism 20 years down the line. I never really grasped the sense of fairness, I think, or even order that came with the fundamentalist view. And so I'm just wondering, how did you marry those two ideas?
So for me, fairness is a part of the ordered landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fairness is what is part of the engine that leads to order, an ordered universe. Yeah, because even if something negative happened to someone that I knew, it was still framed as, well, but this person will have a reward in heaven, and so therefore it's fair. They're getting their just reward. They are going to get their just reward, and so then that contributes to this sense of order and stability, and it's a way to contain the feelings of chaos.
I understand that. I can understand that. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. So for me, it was tough because I didn't really have a lot of order in my life. My family, we moved 7 or 8 times before I was in 6th grade. And then was kind of steady for a while. And then I moved out when I was 17 or 18 into my grandparents' home. So I don't think I ever experienced that sense of structure and order that you did. I remember when I was 13, my mother tried to give me consequences for something. And I remember saying, "Mom, it's too late. I'm too old." As if you didn't set my routine early enough for me to respect the consequences that you're going to lay out in front of me. And I had sort of developed my own way out, you know what I mean? I didn't have the same discipline, and I still don't, and it's tough. It can be very tough that you do, but there is definitely a sense of freedom in not having order, and I can understand your envy of that, because even though I can find myself distracted more often or having trouble, not necessarily planning, I really enjoy planning, but sticking to plans, right? Even though that happens where I go away from a plan that I've made, I still feel like it is my domain, right? Like I've sort of set this chaotic pattern for myself where so that like I don't feel like I'm obedient to a routine or slave to a routine.
Oh yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, that's your way of, it's interesting that you have agency in like not following plans.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of my favorite things is like planning and then giving myself a lot of space to move out of those plans. And so I really enjoy the whole process of like, okay, what am I going to do at 10 o'clock? And I love when I'm like, it's like 10:15 and I'm still working on the previous project, because I'm like, oh, I must be really interested. So like, because I'm breaking this routine, it must mean that like I want to, but no, really it means like I can't follow a routine for shit. You know what I mean? It's like,
so I was going to ask, so do you locate that in your childhood? Like in your,
oh
do
yeah.
you think that that's a direct result of the kind of lack of?
Yeah. Oh, totally. It's so funny because like, I say it's so funny a lot when it's really just not at all a joke, but I don't, again, like my dad was tidy-ish. He had a place for everything, but my mom was kind of a mess. I love her, but she was a mess. And it didn't have to do with God. Like, I think that in this particular way, my parents were one of those people who, maybe my mother was sort of one of those people who like rejected the side that said, you have to sort of maintain a like clean home and a clean life in order to be like a perfect Christian. I think that she wisely embraced the idea of a relationship with God being that, instead of some sort of like reward for service thing. And I think, I kind of like that idea from her perspective. And I found like a lot of people in our church were like that. I mean, our pastor wasn't like a rigid person and was not like it wasn't like reward for hard work. It was, I mean, I know some people who were, but some of the elders, but certainly not him. And so it's just very interesting to see how vastly different fairness and order can be among the many people in a fundamentalist Christian community, because one of them, on one side, it's like, oh no, we're forgiven, there is chaos and we are forgiven for being imperfect, for being disorderly, for falling short of the mark. And then there are others who are like, no, we need to strive to be better. We need to strive to be holier. We need to, or else we will not like enter the kingdom of heaven,
Yeah. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about the thinking about my parents in this broader context of, like it's not all Christian fundamentalist linked those two, like having a tidy house with being a good Christian. So
yeah, I mean, I see it. Like, I mean, if you walk into it in terms of like godliness, I think if you walked into my home versus your home, that people would assume that your family was more godly, which is kind of like weird and a little bullshit. But yeah, I mean, one time I had someone I really liked growing up once said, talk about like fairness, right? Once said that he didn't want to date someone because her father wasn't a picture of like a righteous man, or wasn't like a stable, human. And so it's like, it's really interesting to me to think like, how is that fair? How does God look on that? Right? Like, I mean, if we like actually think about it for a little while, and I don't want this to become like a big, debate world, but like, I mean, Jesus wasn't like that. Like, how did fundamentalist Christianity become so rigid? When Jesus told the disciples to like leave their job and just follow, and don't get me wrong, like I love both ideas. I love the idea that like tidiness and hard work and order causes success, and that fairness is true. I love those concepts. I wish I could believe in them, and I can for the, like with a probability of like 0.7. But beyond that, it's just like luck and opportunity. And I really feel that, my parents were really poor. My family was poor and, not destitute, but poor. And I remember thinking how unfair that was. And in terms of like who got attention at church, it was always like the elders' kids. And I was like just some family's child who like didn't go to church all the time, had issues with everyone. And like, I mean, those are the things that make me not believe, those are really the seeds, at least, of like unfairness, as seeing a God who you believe should be fair or could be fair and isn't.
Can you, because I'm really interested, so I'm interested in both of the things you were just talking about, but can you talk more about how poverty affected your view of fairness? Because I think that's really important to dwell on.
Yeah. So my mother worked really hard in school. She was in college from when I was in kindergarten all the way up until I graduated. She spent a lot of time because, she was also taking care of us. She graduated a couple times, but, from Oral Roberts University, which is an evangelism school or it's basically like a seminary, kind of. I don't know what you call it. I don't know what you'd call Oral Roberts. It's like a seminary. Evangelism. Yeah. And so anyway, so she graduated from there, and then she went to school for teaching and history. And the life never, do I say never? Life didn't often give us a break. I mean, maybe we found like $20 on the sidewalk every once in a while, but for the amount of time that my mother poured into being better and serving God, I mean, if her reward was in heaven, I don't even know if people who were members of the church would say, no, she has a great reward in heaven, and I don't know whether, like, I just don't think she was noticed. I don't think her hard work was recognized. That doesn't mean that, like, if God existed, that he wouldn't have rewarded her. But what I'm saying is I saw the unfairness. I saw the mistakes that people made in their assumptions about my family. And that definitely contributed to how angry I get about how unfair, class differences can be, and how unfair even stereotypes and viewpoints can be of like no, we weren't even broken family, but you know what I'm saying? Like, people didn't think my family was perfect. I mean, my people didn't think my family was like together. But yeah, so fairness played a big part in how I feel about the same today,
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. Classism is definitely a real thing, and I remember, even from my perspective in the church, like now, I mean, I obviously wasn't aware of it at the time, but the way that people talked about your family definitely was like coded. Like they used a lot of like coded terms, and even just like the tone was like, oh, right, like this family like has issues, whatever, which is
Right.
because every family has issues.
Right. Like, who are you? Right. Yeah. Like, and I mean, even for me, like, it's funny because like I didn't feel like I belonged well with my family, and I don't know what that's supposed to, I don't know when you're smart and when you're a bright person and you see people see your family like that, like it does some things that, are not necessarily fair. I saw my mom so much differently then than I do now. And I don't think it's only because of youth and ignorance. I think that people put ideas, people, would say things to me about like, oh, well, you're so smart, like, how did you come from where you came from, and they like that, like I wasn't able to see my family for the good and could only really see what other people saw. It wasn't until like I deconverted and I unmarried myself from those ideas that I started to be grateful for my mom and my dad, and I do think that's really, really unfair.
Yeah, no, that I I agree. Like hearing you talk about them, like, was there a specific, I mean, without like naming names, but like, was there something specific you remember someone saying, like, I don't know, about your mom, or like you had said her work went unnoticed?
Yeah, my mom did. My mom. So my mom was. So when we lived in Oklahoma, my mom went to India for a year, or no, was it a year? No, my mom went to India for like a month. I think it was a month, and just to like speak at churches and to get to know ministers and evangelize and be a part of that world, And she's divorced. So, there may have been an aspect of that, especially in our old church, because they were very fundamentalist, conservative Christians, and you're not supposed to be like in ministry or in evangelism if you're divorced. So that might have been a piece of it. But also, like, she had a booth on the 4th of July. Every year, my mom had a booth for her ministries. And I've never seen anyone so unsupported by a church or an entity, especially when they were trying to do work for God, when they were trying to like raise money to be an evangelist, to be a minister. And yeah, I know.
I didn't even know that, but that speaks to the problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I was always like involved in a different booth.
Yeah, no, we always were
connected with our church.
Cotton candy.
The 4th of July, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know, and that's fine. It just breaks my heart sometimes. Not that I would, but even so, like, it's just so frustrating when you can see people who are either men or who are kind of praised in the church, who get to travel, who get to, go to Mexico and learn dance, who get to like really practice what they want to practice because there's families together. I just don't believe. I can't, that must be one of the things that led to me deconverting, because it makes no sense to me that like, it's very much like presidency, right? Like all the presidents are from like a previous president, through some sort of line or whatever, right? Like that, yeah, historical debate. That's sort of what it feels like in the church. You can't be a minister unless your like dad was a minister, or or your mom was like a really good pastor's wife or something, like.
Yeah, there was like definitely this You're totally right. Like, especially in our church in particular, like this kind of, well, it's like a kind of privilege,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like hierarchy where people had certain clout because of who they were related to. And that's partly because it was fundamentalist, but partly just also because our church was very small. So I think that was a big part of it too.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't escape all the family connections.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. But I do think, I mean, and even so, I think that does happen a lot. I don't think it was just our church where there's sort of like this inner circle of leaders, where, they say leaders beget leaders, but it's really like, no, like you just notice those people because they're, parents were leaders or they're, so yeah. So yeah, I mean, fairness probably was worse for me than order, but in a totally opposite way than you. Totally.
How does that so how does this concept of fairness, how does that affect you now that you've deconverted? Like what are some of your, I don't know, like what's your emotional?
Oh wow, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I think it's nicer now. Like, I think now that I don't think there's a God who's like stupidly unfair, who just doesn't want to pay attention to me. I can't tell you, Heather, how many times I've said in the past like 12 years, because I don't believe that I'm smarter than some of the people who believe in God. And that's sort of how I like judge. I don't believe that my reasoning is perfect. And so sometimes I think like, okay, I can see someone with better reasoning and they believe in God. And I really respect their reasoning, their logic, and can follow it. And so for me, when I don't know how many times I've said it's just faith. Like, it's just a matter of faith that I've like changed, that I'm not a Christian and you are. It's just a matter of faith, Although I think over the past couple of years, I've sort of leaned on the side of like, no, I really do think I'm an agnostic. I really do think that I'm more atheist than I am a theist, But that being said, in terms of fairness, I feel like it is easier for me to believe that there is not a God and chaos reigns. Children die. Children get cancer. The number of people who have mental disabilities who do horrible things, that to me makes more sense when I blame it on evolutionary mutation, when I blame it on chromosomes, when I blame it on nurture. That makes more sense to me than a God who's just, no, that's part of my plan. How is, and I'm sorry, how is pedophilia a part of any God's plan? How is rape, mutilation? I don't see a God who needs that to carry out their plan. I mean, I'm not omniscient. I'll give you that. But as far as I know, no one is, So yeah, so it affects me because I'm allowed to believe that life is supposed to be this way. And that feels good. So.
And too, I imagine you can, because I feel this way too, there is a pleasure that comes from being able to actually call people out. Homelessness is a problem because wealthy people don't donate enough or whatever, instead, that can be kind of empowering instead of, I don't know. And I'm just speaking for myself. So, but I'm curious to know what you.
Oh no, I totally get what you're saying. It's easier to say, but I don't know. I think that's funny because recently, and I think that individuals are easier to call out in the scope of Christianity whereas social normities are easier to call out in the scope of atheism and antitheism. Not antitheism, but yeah, I want to say atheism or non-theism, right? Because you can say, like, why are women classically submissive to men? You know, and you can call that out on the, you know, but you can't, like, individually, it's like different, right? It's a lot easier to say to a couple who's under Christ, like, well, you're not being really loving to each other. You are not being as the church, as Jesus is to the church. So I think it's interesting because I feel like there's so much social chaos within the church because there are so many interpretations of, like, large scale biblical values, whereas I think it's the opposite in, you know, the non-theist world. But that's just like a weird theory that I just made up right now. So,
well, but I don't know, because I think there's still a lot of chaos in the non-theist world, but in a slightly different way. Like, I hear what you're saying, but I think, so this is what I've experienced, yeah, and especially being in an academic world. Yeah, so it's really easy to identify a cultural condition that's problematic. That's what I'm trained to do, essentially. And but the chaos can still come from what is the solution?
yeah, no, but I think, right, but I think that, like, we as, at least, so I've actually thought about this a lot in the last, like, week, right? Like, I'm like, we as a, mostly because of this, and I don't know, maybe this is, like, going to mess up the chronological timeline of our podcast, but I might just take it out anyway. But I just wanted to say that, like, because of the abortion issues, the abortion, which there's no way this is going to pass. I mean, maybe it could, but I don't think that they'll get it to the Supreme Court and have it go through. But anyway, because of all of this, I realize that though we are divided, there are many, many things that we agree on. Like, many of us agree that murder is wrong. You know, it's sort of, like, easy. I mean, granted, there are, like, some times when everybody's like, okay, well, maybe not, whatever, right? Many of us agree that a child born, we can all agree that a child born whose cord has been cut, who is viable on its own, should not die. Right? That's like like, there are things that we believe in consistently that I think don't necessarily follow as well in the community of the Christian church. I'm not saying that, like, they disagree with those things, right? I think they agree with them. But I think if they feel it's God's will, Christians will go with anything. And that is where, like, I find this, like, social, like, if they're like, well, it was God's will, there becomes this, like, value, this, like, grand social value that doesn't stay as consistent in my brain, in my head.
Well, that helps to explain why, a Christian, a pro-life, not everyone who's pro-life is Christian fundamentalist, but there's a strong connection between the two, obviously. I think so. In this case, a Christian fundamentalist who is pro-life, that explains why there's some inconsistencies from my perspective, an inconsistency, right, in terms of saying I believe murder is wrong, and I believe a fetus is a child, so therefore I believe abortion's wrong. But then once the child is born, if the mentality is this is God's will that the child's alive, then there's less emphasis on our responsibility to provide additional support and social programs, because that, so again, in my opinion, from my perspective, it's just what I get frustrated by is not so much the pro-life stance, but the then inconsistency in terms of not being pro-life but then not sponsoring socialized health care and programs, for women. So anyway, that's what I was getting at. But that makes sense based on what you're saying, like that logic of, well, now, like, we've defended life, and now we can kind of throw up our hands and say, well, this life was meant to be, so therefore it was meant to be, instead of taking more additional responsibility for making sure this is a life of value and dignity.
Right. And so that's why I say, like, it's easier to call out, and for me, it's easier to call out an individual Christian than it is to call out the whole community, because they're not consistent among themselves. And I'm not, like, please understand, I'm not, like, bashing Christians. Like, it's not about that. It's just that they themselves would say, no, we're different than the Baptists, or we're different than the Protestants. We're different than the Catholics, So, as a matter of fact, some of them would be adamant that they were different than the Catholics. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting world, and it's not fair, and for me, it's not orderly. But for me, it's okay, and I think for you, it causes a little more.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Haha, see what I did?
Yeah, I did. In the place of our artistic piece, which we don't have one at the moment, I just thought I would give a shout out to the healthcare workers, the grocery store employees, the farmers, the people who are keeping this country going, and just say thank you. Oh, pharmacists, of course. And just say thank you for being there and for continuing to go to work and put yourselves at risk and your families. There's no way we can repay you. So yeah, just thanks.